So obviously here we are in our fourth session, and it's a lot of practices. So just to say again that these are practices that are meant to cover you in any possible situation you might come up with in your existence. And so they have a very vast view. They're from the awakened perspective, which is seeing the whole of the stream of your existence and is protecting you in every moment. So as you go through your life, whether you take these vows or not, hopefully you'll stay connected to them in some way or another. And, a way in this lineage that we stay connected to them, and many of you are probably already doing this or have gone in and out of doing it, is, we keep this little book, and 6 times a day we check. And that's really helpful because this way you get to cycle through them and you get to just learn them that way. You don't really learn them deeply by just coming to these 5 classes. It's really good to be able to come and hear them, and you get the whole of the vows. And traditionally, this is considered you have the lung. If you've been able to come to all 5 classes, now you have them. So now you are empowered to take them, and you are empowered to study them on your own because you've had an oral transmission. Okay. But it's implied then that you will take them and you'll start to study them and work with them. Okay. I've had the great blessing. I think this is my 6th or 7th time going through them in a class like this. And I go through them, I live with them, and I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface of these vows, barely. It's like I know them well enough now to know that I hardly know them at all. So they're infinitely deep and exquisitely beautiful. And so I just say this to sort of try to allay anything that might be coming up if you start to get overwhelmed by the amount that it is. And just to say they're meant to be savored over time. I remember I went with my parents to this long ago. We went to some French thing in Canada. We were staying there for a vacation. And they would have these dinners, and the dinners went on for 3 hours. And I was really not up for that at 15 or whatever I was. I was sort of like, oh my God, how long do we have to sit here? But it was like they'd bring one course, and then you'd sit with the course for like a half hour. But it'd be like 2 pieces of vegetables, but you'd sit with it for a half hour, And then there'd be a sorbet, and you'd sit with that for 15 minutes, And when I look back at it, it's very beautiful. It's like giving you that space to really taste and enjoy. And it should be this way with the vows. We should give ourselves time to taste them, to enjoy them, to live with them in our life, to learn how they can really nourish us. So I encourage you all to continue to do that as you go forward. All right, so we're finishing up. We just have one more here in the practices that are related to the perfection of wisdom. So this is number 34. Focusing on the vessel and the letter by focusing on the teacher and not the teachings. All right. This is a very, very deep vow, as they all are. But this is like the kicker when it comes to the wisdom practices. Okay, so I'm going to spend a bit of time unpacking this. This is related to what are called the 4 reliances. And I put them there for you. So don't rely on the person, the vehicle, the personality. Rely on the actual teaching. Okay? So again, you might have resonance with a particular personality, but it is the teaching that is going to change your life, okay? Not the individual person. Then, deeper, don't rely on the teaching, the words alone, but try to sense the meaning. What is the meaning of the teaching for you? This is the first level of intimacy, okay? Then Don't rely on the provisional meaning, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, but this means the way you currently relate to it, so somehow thinking the way I first relate to it is the way to relate to it, right? So don't rely on the provisional meaning, but on the deeper definitive meaning. So always seeking a deeper level, always seeking to spend time to open the practice. So never thinking, I got it, I know it, this is what it is. And then ultimately, not relying merely on intellectual understanding, but on direct experience. Okay. So I've told this story many times, and perhaps you've heard me tell it, but I'm going to tell it again because it's such a key story, and it relates to the Four Alliances. And there are many stories like this throughout all spiritual traditions, so you probably have one in your own history that you know. But this is part of the biography of Naropa. Naropa was a great saint and sage and enlightened being within our lineage. And he lived in India, and he ran a great monastery called Nalanda Monastery. And Nalanda Monastery was like, 10,000 monks as they were and still are in certain areas, these huge institutions. And it's essentially for that area and that time, it's like saying he was the president of Yale or he was the president of Princeton, okay? Major, major scholar, one of the greatest debaters of all time. And from a very early age, he was studying Dharma and came into his own. And he was in his 40s, somewhere in his 40s at this point, I believe. And again, is well established in his career. His professional career is to be a monk, right? He's a monk, he's running a monastery. And he has this experience one day where he's outside and he's reading a scripture. And this is key in all these stories. If you look at any of these stories across traditions, again, the trope, the archetype of this story is that the individual, the great sage, is reading, meaning they're engaged with the intellectual pursuit of the spiritual studies, okay? You see this also in the images of the Annunciation, for those of you that grew up with Christianity, right? You see Mary with the angel Gabriel, and the text is laid to the side. But the implication is she's been studying the Bible so deeply that she actually has an experience, a real experience of the divine. And at that moment, the text don't matter. The words fall aside, and you're in the stream, right? So he's reading, and a shadow falls on his text. And the shadow falls, and he feels a shudder of fear. And he looks up, and he sees this grotesque woman coming towards him, this grotesque elderly woman. And she is hunched over, she's drooling, most of her teeth have fallen out. She's got like warts and skin tabs everywhere. Her hair is disgusting. She smells. Everything about her turns his stomach. And he's sort of cornered, like there's nowhere for him to go, and she's coming right at him. And she looks at him, comes really, really close, and looks at him and says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Naropa. I run this monastery." She goes, "Never heard of you." And he looks up and he's sort of like, "Okay." And she says, what are you reading?" He says, "I'm reading texts on logic," and he has all kinds of books around him. He says, "I'm reading a text on logic and epistemology and karma, and I'm reading all these very important Dharma books." She goes, "Oh, okay." She says, "Do you understand the words?" And he says, "Yes, I understand the words." And she starts to do this dance. She gets so happy. She starts to whirl around, and she's kind of like whooping and doing a little jig. And for a moment, she becomes very beautiful to him in her joy. And his heart sort of opens for a moment. It's such a bizarre experience that he's having. And then she, in her, out of her little dance, she turns to him and she goes, "Yes, but do you understand the meaning? And he says, yes. And then she flips and she starts crying and screaming and falls into a full-on tantrum and is in total despair. And he is really overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do, and this is very out of the ordinary. And he says, please, could you calm down, just calm down, what's going on? You know, I don't understand what's happening right now. And she looks at him and she says, well, when you told me that you understand the words, I knew you were telling the truth, because you're a great scholar and you run this monastery, and that made me very happy that you told the truth. She said, but when you told me that you understood the meaning, I knew that you were lying. And that causes me tremendous despair, especially to see someone in a position like yours, a great scholar like you, lying about something like this. And no one has ever provoked him like this before. No one's ever asked him this question. See, 45 or whatever years of studying, no one said, do you understand the meaning of what you're reading? Right? And he knows in his heart that it's true. He's revealed. And what's so extraordinary in the story of Naropa, and such a lesson to all of us, is that in that moment where most of us would cover because we've been exposed to something so, this is his life, this is his career, and he's basically going, I'm just realizing that I don't really know anything about what I'm teaching at the end of the day. And he, instead of pulling away, he says, who knows the meaning? Where can I find the meaning? And she says, well, my brother Tilopa knows the meaning. And so again, like a good student, a real spiritual seeker, he says, where can I find him? I'll go find him so I can really understand the meaning. And she says, well, my brother Tilopa, he doesn't live anywhere. She says, if you have real desire, pure desire in your heart to learn the meaning, he'll appear for you. He'll come. And then she disappears. So he's had, in some versions of the story, this is put forth as a dream. It's probably better to say a vision. It's an inner vision that he's having. And in a way, it doesn't really matter whether it's true, like whether it actually happened or didn't actually happen. It's this moment that we all have to pass through in our studies, where we come to the step where we go, okay, I understand the meaning. This is the first three here are intellectual. I understand the meaning, or I understand the words, and I have some intellectual understanding of the meaning, but do I have the experience? Have I experienced this? And if not, you're not done, right? And so then there's, in his story, you can buy his biography online and read his whole story, which is quite extraordinary. But he leaves the monastery, he leaves his job completely. He quits the monastery, not without a lot of resistance from the other people there. But he quits. It's said he never looks at another book in his life, which may not be the case for all of us in our path. But he'd spent so much of his time only on study, and he's like, I'm done with that. I've already ingested everything I could possibly ingest on that level. And what's so great is he goes out into the world, and then he has what are called the 12 minor trials before he actually meets his teacher. Now, another thing we can talk about, I don't want to get too far into this, I love this story, but is that he has a vision of a female, a woman. It's not so much about male or female externally, but the feminine principle is related to wisdom. So he has an experience of wisdom, a vision of wisdom that comes to him and says, by the way, you don't know what you're talking about yet. Right? In that kind of wily way that wisdom can do. And of course, if you study any kind of myth or stories like this, you'll see the hag, this image of the hag is an archetype across. And what it is, not so much, again, about an old woman, although in our lives, we could sort of see, like, where is the elder? Where is the elder who points out where I'm missing, But what is so disgusting to him is he's seeing all of his affliction in front of him. His affliction is terrified by this because she's coming towards him and she's going to point out what he's missing. And that's terrifying. It's disgusting to him, right? He doesn't want to look at his own lie. So he has an image of the feminine, and then she says to him, you have to find my brother. So he's not saying you have to find a man necessarily, although his teacher ends up being a man embodied. But she's saying you have to find someone in body to teach you now. You got to get out of these books. You have to relate to an actual human being. Go find my brother, and if you really want to find him, if you really want to connect with the true meaning of the Dharma, he will come to you. You will have an enlightened connection with a teacher. You will find him, okay? Very moving to me. So these two sides of ourselves, the inner vision, which is feminine, related to the feminine principle, and the outer vision, which they say is related to the masculine, that which is embodied, right? So what happens is he goes out into the world and he goes through these 12 minor trials, which aren't so minor when he actually goes through them. But in each of them, he's basically encountering the world in a way he hadn't ever encountered it before. He's dealing with people and animals and all kinds of things, right? He's, as we've been talking about, he starts to include other people into his world. And each time he does, so one after another, he has an encounter with someone, he sees his habit of how he has dogma and relationship around it, and he sort of turns away and he creates a barrier. And then that person or animal or whatever it is turns into a vision of the divine and goes, shouldn't do that. You're never going to find your teacher that way, right? You're never going to find the enlightened mind that way. So like there, he meets a maggoty dog, and he's sort of disgusted. It's really key. We can tune in with what disgusts us to see like what it is that we don't want to go towards. And instead of like finding a way to help the dog or go around it, he jumps over it, which is very, very disgraceful in India to jump over things. You know, you put the soles of your feet over something, and the dog like turns into this vision and goes, you know. And then he has another one that I like, and then I got to move on. But he has another one that I really like where he meets this fisherman couple, and they're, you know, he's a monk, so he doesn't eat meat. He's got all this dogma about this space, and they're cooking up some food and cooking up fish and doing their thing, and they invite him to a meal. They say, like, come have a meal with us. And at that point it's just the wife. He encounters the wife, and she comes and she invites him, and he says, you know, I'm a monk. I'm not allowed to do this. But it's not so much that, it's the judgment that's in his mind, right? He's going, well, you guys are common folks, so you just have a fish fry. But of course, I'm a very important scholar, and so I don't eat meat. And I want to make that clear to you, right? So he says that. And then, again, if you were discerning and you weren't eating meat because it was discerning for your path, that would be one thing. But at this point, he's judging. So then the husband comes up, and he's got a whole bunch of more fish with him, and he goes, well, who's this, you know, who showed up at our house? And she said, oh, it's this monk. He's a little retarded. Because I invited him for a good meal, and he won't eat it, you know. And then, you know, Naropa has this moment of like, what? You know, his judgment is turned back on him. And then the husband takes one of the fish off the grill, and he throws it up into the air, and the fish goes back to life and falls in the water and swims away. You know, and he looks at Naropa and he's like, what's your relationship to reality, man? You know? So these go on and on, right? Until Naropa's mind is purified enough of judgment that he can have a direct encounter with a teacher, with actually seeing someone who can really help him. And then he starts to go forward. So but the main reason why I wanted to tell you this story is that this moment when she says, do you understand the words or the meaning? This is related to this vow. This is the provocation that we constantly have to be at in our own mind. It is really, really important to understand the words. So it's not like you just skip to the fourth reliance. You have to go through them all, okay? But if you stop at 1 through 3, you'll always be relying on something else. So ultimately, the fourth is saying, you're not relying on anything because you've had direct experience. The first 3, you are relying. You're relying on intellectual understanding. You're relying on someone else's teaching, someone else's words, someone else's meaning, etc. Okay? And these will keep us separate. They'll keep us from being in our own experience. So we want to try to go all the way through, and that's not easy, and it takes time, but it is clear. If you have a direct experience, it is clear, because it is so vastly different than the intellectual understanding. And sometimes it's so vastly different, we can't even draw the line. It's challenging for us to draw the line. And so I realized at a certain point a little while ago that for myself and for many of the people that I am in conversation and am working with, that I actually believe they have had many quite profound experiences, but they haven't had the mind or the practice to draw the line back. And so they're in this space where they're going, I don't know all this stuff. I don't know what it means. I haven't really, but it's actually, no, you have. You've probably had a number of these experiences already. And so I think it's really key, to tune into that. I wanted to tell you another way of thinking about these, which is really nice, is it comes from Judaism. And Dima, you probably know way more about this than I do, so. Well, I just want to preface this by saying that I am not a scholar of Judaism by any means, not even close. But I've come across these and I've read a couple commentaries, and I find it very inspiring and very related to the four reliances. So it's helpful for me to sort of look at the two. And I didn't put this down, but I'll tell you about them. So the story in Judaism is that these four rabbis go into this orchard. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Pardes? The 4 ways to look at the Torah? I'm sure you've heard it. I'm going to tell it, and then you're going to be like, oh, right, okay. So these 4 rabbis go into an orchard, and the orchard is symbolic of entering the Torah, of entering the words of the divine, of study, okay? And the first rabbi goes in and has an experience of the truth, and he dies. And the second rabbi goes in, has an experience of the truth, and goes insane. The third rabbi goes in, has an experience of the divine, experience of the truth, and turns completely away from his path. And the fourth rabbi goes in, has an experience of the truth, of the divine, and exits in total peace, in union with God. So these 4 are related to these 4 reliances, to these 4 stages. So in the Jewish tradition, the first rabbi goes in, and he's relying on the literal meaning of the text, okay, which is similar to ours. So, don't worry about who's teaching it, just try to get the teaching, okay? And you can think about it 2 ways, or I've been thinking about it 2 ways. One is that if you're relying on the literal meaning of the scripture, similar to the story of the branch deer, the branch deer who was the one who was set on the rules, right? The foundational practices, you will live a good life. You'll have a good life. You'll live an ethical life. You'll be relatively happy, okay. You're going to try not to cause other people harm, and then you'll die, like everyone dies. So you probably won't break out of your status quo if you stick with the literal meaning. You probably won't cause too much harm, but you won't break out of your status quo either. And so your life will go and you'll die. Another way to think of this, which is maybe not so conducive to the actual teaching I'm giving right now in the 4 reliances, but just to offer it to you, is that an experience of heaven or an experience of the truth, or you come into contact with the literal meaning, and it's so intoxicating to you that you die to the world and you get caught up. And this, last week, if you remember, in relation to the practices that had to do with meditation, we had the practice of not getting caught up in the pleasant sensations, right? So this is pointing to there's bliss out there. Heaven is a wonderful place. And if you forget the world, if you forget others, that's not a good death, actually. That's not a good death. The point is not to get in contact with heaven and forget everyone else. The point is to come in contact and share that and extend that out. It's like they say with retreat, the idea of retreat is not that you go into retreat and disappear. You go into retreat, change your mind, transform your life, and come out and relate to the world in a more proper way, a more meaningful way, right? So this is the first one, okay? So if you're only relying on the literal meaning, either you'll die to the world and you'll get separated from others, or you'll just go through your life in a fairly ordinary way, live a good life and die. It's okay. Bless you. The second rabbi goes in and he goes insane, right? So this is interesting. So if we look at the second reliance, this is not relying on the teaching itself, but trying to intuit the spirit or the meaning, okay? Starting to sense it in your heart. So taking it out of the mind and trying to drop it down into the heart. What does this mean? What does it mean for me? How do I feel it? And in the Jewish tradition, this is relating to the symbolic meaning of the text. So you start to sense, like, it's not literal. What is it symbolizing? What is it trying to point me towards? Okay? So this is the interpretation or the implied meaning, they might say. And as I think of this, you know, if you only go that far, you go insane. Because it's like you're relying on archetype or something. You're relying on symbol. You're not going through the symbol to connect with something. So there's either the literal meaning, and then there's the symbolic meaning, which is a pathway. It's meant to be a pathway to something else. But if you stop in the symbolic space, you're not connected to yourself, and you're not connected to others anymore either. So you're sort of nowhere, and you go crazy. All right? So it's important to go through these steps. What it's saying is don't stop there. So we have to break out of the literal meaning and try to sense what the deeper, more poetic, more symbolic meaning might be. Okay? The next step, the next rabbi goes through, oh, I'm sorry, another little shade of this, which is nice, is that the second rabbi, it said, so he has this experience, so he goes deeper than the first, but that he hasn't actually purified enough in the foundational practices. His mind isn't pure enough to meet with the symbolic meaning, so he turns it and sort of twists it around to serve himself. So again, I like that shade of it, because it's saying, again, you got to have your ethics in place. And if your ethics are in place, you'll naturally start to have deeper experiences, and you'll know how to relate to them in a meaningful way. You won't twist them to serve yourself. Okay? The next one, right, he goes in and then he turns away from his path, right, which is very, which is a terrifying space in one's practice, but again, a necessary space to go through. So the third reliance in the Buddhist practice is that you're not relying on the provisional meaning, but you're relying on the deeper meaning. So again, you're recognizing that the way to interpret something, that your current state is one of many, many particular views you could take on something. And again, it's one thing to understand this intellectually, but here we're starting to point to a real experience, awareness, that your view is one of many, okay? So as you become more available to openness, your transformation gets deeper. You're going to recognize how relational things are, and in a way, how flimsy things are. And your view really is. Your view is one of many. Your view holds for a moment and changes, okay? And, you know, this, if, again, you don't have the foundation in place, you can see how that level of openness, that level of recognition that, for instance, the way emptiness is taught in one way, that's just one way of many ways. So you might get lost. And you might start to go, oh, well, then I'll go over here, and I'll go over there, and I'll go over there, right? So the third rabbi goes in, he gets so open. He frees himself to a certain degree intellectually, where he realizes that he has all these possibilities of how he can view the world. And he loses his path. He gets lost. So again, we may or may not have already passed through these spaces in our life, where the path itself, the discipline of the path itself, does what it's supposed to do and opens us past the discipline. And in that moment, we got to be really mindful that we don't stop there. That we don't just start to go, oh yeah, anything is anything, and everything works. It's all, there's another level from there. So if you stop there, you'll get lost. You'll get off your path. And there are many, many warnings about this in different ways through different texts of like, at a certain point, you got to, in a way, go back to the foundation so you don't get off, because you're going to go so open. So this is like a warning, okay, if you're not there yet. In the Jewish tradition, this third stage, it's a little bit different than the Buddhist one, but we can sort of look at it. It's when you start to get to the level where you can start comparing and contrasting teachings. So you're teaching well enough that you can begin to do analytical meditation around it, and you can read other texts. Do you know what I'm talking about? We already sort of do this in our practice, and I've already been doing it through class. That's a tricky area. You got to really have some foundation in yourself if you're going to start doing some like comparative teachings, okay? Because you can get lost in confusion. And similar to the vow we talked about earlier today, you can get swayed. If you're not one of those people who have enough belief in yourself, you can get swayed, okay? So it's really good and an extraordinary blessing on your spiritual path to go past your provisional self and to be in a state of awareness in your being where you can be with your provisional self, but also know that you are not held in that self. So you can start to sense, yeah, there's me right now with my limitations, but that's not me. That's my sense of me right now, which is different than beforehand where you're like, no, it's me. This is who I am, right? So we want to get to the point where we're like, I don't know who I am. I'm not really here. Who's here? But if you stop there, it's like, where am I, right? So we sort of have to go from being lost in the samsaric way to being found in a path to actually being lost again. It's important to go through and get lost again. But you want to go through it until you're found, like the fourth rabbi. So the fourth rabbi goes in, right, and he comes out in union with God. And it's very beautiful. I find it very moving in the Jewish tradition. They talk about this stage. So you've gone through the literal meaning, the symbolic meaning or the poetic meaning, through all the comparative meanings, through all the different viewpoints that you might have on the teaching. And then you get blessed with the mystical meaning. You have a revelation of the mystical meaning of the text, which is so cool. And this is, as I talked about earlier with wisdom, and they speak about this in the commentaries that I've read on these teachings in the Jewish tradition, this is given only through grace. This is given through inspiration. So this is a direct experience of wisdom, okay? And if you have that, you will exit the orchard in peace. You will exit your studies in peace. So here you go beyond being a self, not only a singular self, but a self that has many possible selves. You go beyond self altogether, okay? And you go into total unification with the source. It's one way they describe it in the commentaries that I've read, which I also find very moving. You become unified with the source. So this is similar to the Buddhist teaching, rely on your direct experience. It's a little more dry in the Buddhist teaching, which often happens sometimes in the way they traditionally offer things. But it's the same, actually. The direct experience is saying you will have a mystical experience. You will go beyond the intellectual. That's what it means to have a mystical experience, is you are taken beyond the cognitive, okay? Beyond the conceptual, all right? So what does this mean as a practice, right? How do you practice this as a vow? What is this? Heather's like, yeah, let's talk about that. So because the fourth is given, the fourth is a blessing of grace, we can focus on the first three. So we can be sure to really study deeply and to make sure we understand the literal meaning, to make sure that we've come to classes like this and we're not caught up in the stories that I tell, or we're not caught up in whatever it is, the method of teaching, but that we take it home and we look at it and you know for yourself that you understand these vows, okay? In such a way you could explain it to someone else and they could understand it, okay? Then past that, you want to make sure that you go beyond the literal meaning to start to feel it in your heart, to sense what it's pointing you to in your life. Symbolic means it goes past this text And then you look at Tanel and it's like, how do I relate to Tanel? That's when it starts to get symbolic, even though in a way it's also quite direct because it's another person. But it starts to become active in your life, okay? So move to that step for yourselves. You can't move to the second step until you've actually learned it. Got to learn it, then you got to feel it, sense it. How is it working? How do I live with this, okay? Start to connect with others, connect with yourself. Then the third level, start to explore all the other possible relationships you can have to it. And this also means you live with it over time, okay? So you don't just listen to this class, you go read the other commentaries, you listen to all the other teachers who've taught the Bodhisattva vows. You start to go, well, what are Bodhisattva vows in other traditions? How do they explain these teachings? What is a Bodhisattva vow in the Christian tradition? What is it, what is it not in any religious tradition, but how does the person I live with who doesn't have any spiritual tradition, what is their version of a Bodhisattva vow, right? So you start to get all those comparative analytical spaces, which is another level of compassion, so you can relate to more people. So on each level, you're getting more compassionate, okay? So first level, literal meaning. Second level, you could say personal meaning, and then extending on how you personally are relating to it in your life. Third level, how are others relating to it? And how do you connect or disconnect with all those different relations, okay? If you're doing those three, you will have the fourth experience, for sure, okay? You don't need to, where the fourth will come. But be mindful that as you're expanding yourself out to include others into your world, you don't get lost. You don't get lost, and the way you don't get lost, okay, really practically, the way you don't get lost is you keep meditating. Because your meditation practice brings you internal. It allows you to go back in, to be with yourself, to confirm what's happening in your own being, and then to come out strengthened and relate to other beings, okay? So sometimes as we get deeper on our Bodhisattva path and we're doing all kinds of service and we're doing all kinds of help and we have families and friends and etc. and the vows I'm going to go over in a minute are like, help everybody all the time, And that's great. But that is balanced by a foundational practice of internal seeking and introspection. And if you lose the introspection, that's not going to have much meaning for you. And then all of a sudden you're going to start to realize, well, you're doing all kinds of service, but you're never meditating. And then you sort of don't remember why you were doing service in the first place. And then you're sort of doing service, but you start to do service in an afflicted way. And it sort of goes, I've watched this process in my own life. I've sort of gone in and out of it over a couple cycles, enough to say, then all of a sudden you realize you're relating to people just in an ordinary way like you were before. But you're doing more for others. So you can sort of fall back in that and be like, yeah, but I'm doing lots of stuff for others. But if, in those moments, if I was really honest, I'd go, I'm sort of just back in my ordinary life. And in all of those times, I recognized that I fell off my meditation practice. And I fell off keeping my book. And I fell off of those introspective practices that were taking me back into my own heart. And I just was going out. So you really need the balance. Because the fourth reliance, the mystical meaning or the direct experience, is a completely internal experience. So we go internal to go out, to have the out feed the internal in quite an extraordinary way. Got to have those balances, okay? We could talk just about this vow for 5 sessions alone, but is that, and I feel like I said a lot, but I hope, does that give you some grounding? Is that clear about how to sort of start to relate to these? Okay, because this last one in the wisdom vows is really the kicker. And I'd ask you to really look at it and keep studying it for yourself. So, I wrote down here, I think this was a note for myself, but I'll read it because it's funny. I wrote, status quo, a little weird, lost, found in peace. So it's like, either you sort of stay in your status quo, but you're a little better person. Then when you start to relate to the symbolic space, the poetic space, you might get a little weird. You might get a little insane. Insane in relation to who you were before. You see, you start relating to the world differently. So from your status quo point of view, you're a little weird. You know, and then if you keep going into your weirdness, which is really important, then you're like really weird. You're totally lost. You're like wacko, you know. And as we had that vow last week about you know, not appearing like a total weirdo, like, you know, maybe go to a movie once in a while or like read the paper once in a while so that you actually are like connected. And then, you know, if you keep going, you'll be in peace. So those are the vows related to the 6 perfections. Okay. I'd like to go through, and it won't take too long for the rest of the class. I'd like to go through the vows that are related, the rest of the secondary vows, basically. And then we will have finished with the secondary vows. Next week, there are just a few cleanup, extra vows that are sort of cleanup that'll take us about an hour or so. And then we'll have some time for questions. And then we're going to take a little break. Heather's taking her Bodhisattva vows next week. She's already taken this course and has been studying them and is sort of re-studying them now with me. So we'll have the blessing of actually having a ceremony. So those of you who are interested in taking it and haven't seen a ceremony, you can actually see a ceremony. I thought we would do the also do the ceremony that goes with taking the wish. And if you remember that, there's no commitments. You just say, I wish to have the wish, but you don't have to if you don't want to. You can participate by speaking or just witness. And then we'll have a little time for a party. So basically like the last hour of class next week will just be vows and party. And the first 2 hours we'll do a little cleanup and make sure there aren't any questions or concerns with anything that have come up. So that's the shape of next week. But right now let's take let's take 4 minutes until we get to 10 to 4. Just stretch out, go to the bathroom if you need to, clear your mind because that was a lot, and we'll come back and finish up the secondary vows.